All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Romina Boccia, Director of Budget and Entitlement Policy at the Cato Institute, editor of Debt Dispatch on Substack, and co-author of the new book Reimagining Social Security: Global Lessons for Retirement Policy Changes. Welcome to Free the Economy, Romina.
Thanks so much for having me and my book on the show today.
Great. So I've been hearing my whole life that Social Security is in a crisis and that young workers, whether that was young workers 20 years ago or young workers today, don't actually expect it to be solvent by the time they retire. Is the situation really worse than it was 10 or say 20 years ago?
What is much worse than was the case 20 years ago is that we no longer have payroll tax surpluses. In the early 2000s, when President Bush was talking about private accounts that would allow workers to build real wealth in accounts that they owned and controlled, instead of giving all the payroll taxes to the government through Social Security, um, we had surpluses that we saw the government was spending in other areas. They were expanding programs like Medicare Part D, the prescription drug benefit. Um, we wouldn't even have had a surplus in 2001 that a lot of folks like to take credit for if it hadn't been for the Social Security surpluses at that time that offset other government deficits. And it made it also easier to do tax cuts at that time and later. And so what we've witnessed is that Congress spent the Social Security surpluses in other areas. And so options like privatizing Social Security have expired because now to do something like that would require either double taxing earlier generations, basically asking them to pay for the retirement benefits of the elderly today and pre-fund their own retirement accounts, or you have to keep the Ponzi scheme going in some form, which is why in the book we're really focused on what are reforms that would reduce the growth in benefits, which seems like it should be a politically viable option, so we don't end up raising taxes on younger generations, especially if you think that the current Medicare and Social Security payroll tax is already at a punitive level for many
Mhm.
workers. Then how do we prevent that from being raised? And maybe you also don't want to eliminate the payroll tax threshold, which would just impose the 12.6 Social Security tax on all earnings. That would be a huge marginal tax increase for many small business owners and top earning professionals like physicians, for example, your doctor who provides care for you. That could have a lot of unintended consequences, including less innovation, as it would basically take a lot of money away that's currently going back into these businesses, say, for example. Um, and so, what options are on the table remaining? So, yes, it has gotten much worse because the longer you wait, the more people are drawing benefits from the program. And politically, it's much more difficult to take something away once you've given it than to say, you know what, we're going to reduce the growth in benefits on a forward-looking basis, and we're
Mhm.
going to exempt anyone within 10 years of retirement. Unfortunately, at this point, even those options are no longer sufficient to make the program solvent without a massive inflow of additional borrowing or new taxes.
Right. So the book includes both you and your own co-author's own analysis, which I think is great, but also the perspective of uh, a bunch of different experts that you brought in for a Cato Institute conference last year on Social Security, and that the book is, but in some parts, kind of an outgrowth of all of those discussions. Tell us what sort of the conference was like. Again, the sort of the concept behind it, and then when among the experts that you brought in, including some international experts, was there consensus? Was there agreement versus a lot of disagreement among the panelists? Um, uh, where was the sort of like tenor in the room?
So the conference was held at Cato in May of 2024, and my goal for the conference was to learn from other countries that have been in similar economic and demographic deep waters as the United States now finds itself in. So I picked countries as case studies that basically had their fiscal crises before we we're having ours. And so in most cases, these countries reformed their pension programs, healthcare programs, other programs that were draining their government coffers in the 90s when they were suffering their fiscal crises. And why did that happen? Because a lot of these countries are European countries, they're older than the United States. Or in the case of New Zealand, which is a much younger country, they actually suffered an external shock when their major trading partner, the UK, shifted focus towards becoming a part of the European Union. This was part before Brexit, and so those were the examples we picked, and then we brought in experts from all of those countries so they could tell us about the kinds of things we may not be able to read in the news or in research reports about what really happened. And the questions I wanted to focus on were really what was the trigger for your government to make these economically necessary but politically difficult choices? And then how did they overcome the political barriers to making those reform changes? What were the discussions that went on, and were there any mechanisms or procedures that um, crystallized themselves as most effective, like a fiscal commission, for example, or consulting an independent advisory board to provide political cover for politicians to make those changes? Or in New Zealand, the parties striking a political accord, agreeing not to attack each other on this issue of pension reform so they could get it done together. How did you actually get these reforms done? And then more specifically, what reforms did you adopt? Which is also very interesting because we can now look back and we have over, 30 years roughly of history to see how did those reforms play out, which worked, which had to be tweaked further, and what outcomes did you achieve. In terms of consensus, I would say that most of the panelists were focused on how do we preserve growth in this environment where we've promised generous benefits to an aging population? How do we rebalance the social contract between what we're charging younger generations to cover the benefits that we've promised to older generations? And how do we find a better balance where it's not so lopsided as your population ages, the tax burden on the younger generation grows ever larger, which then also reduces economic growth because you're basically taking away discretionary income from people that they're not able to consume, not able to invest because you're transferring it to the older generation. And so that there was a lot of consensus around the importance of rebalancing those things. And then there were differences in how different countries approached it, some leaning more heavily on tax increases of some form or another. In Germany, for example, they decided to use, right now it's up to 30% of general revenue financing, basically breaking the link between what workers pay and what retirees receive, and say we'll just have to use general taxation to make up the difference. And in other cases, like in Sweden, they actually carved out a private retirement account from their existing payroll tax base. And that has been actually one of the greatest boons for Sweden, in that those balances are growing by like 10% a year. And that is increasingly crowding out the need for generous government benefits as people become more financially independent from their private sector investments. And so I would say in terms of disagreements, there were some that had more ideological positions about the role that financial autonomy should play and individual liberty and allowing people to decide how much to save and invest and when,
Mm.
versus folks who believe more in the need for government to dictate to make sure that everyone has a sufficient amount, or are concerned that if you allow people the freedom, then some people will make bad decisions and we need to prevent that. And then folks that were just, let's just do whatever is most economically efficient. That was sort of the position that came out of Sweden. It's like, we don't care about big government, small government. We want to do what works.
Mhm. Well, you know, the phrase used about sort of, changing or sort of renegotiating the social contract, sort of the idea about like what is, like in the US case, what is Social Security for? I think that comes through and multiple points in the book where the recommendation definitely seems to be that we need to emphasize that Social Security is a kind of anti-poverty sort of retirement anti-poverty program. The main reason it's there, we want it to be there, is so that people who are no longer working and money is not coming in for them on a regular basis, like don't most people, that they're not in permanent poverty when they retire. Whereas the way I think a lot of people think about Social Security now, and I've had for a long time, they think about it as if it were an individual retirement account. Now we know it's not, right? Now, each individual American, they have a Social Security number, and Social Security Administration, IRS, is keeping track of, how many weeks and months and years they work. I think Social Security says they do it in quarters, which is even more confusing. Um, so they know how many quarters you've worked. Uh, but you don't have an account. You don't have an individual account balance, which some people, Americans, kind of think in the back of their mind it does exist. Um, but the question is like, well, should it be more like that, or should it be more like an anti-poverty program? And it seems like, again, a lot of the experts in the book would say, oh, well, we need to move towards a situation where it's just a sort of like anti-poverty backstop, and then we need to have actual individual accounts, just you know, private accounts, not a sort of semi-privatized version of Social Security. So how how do you think the messaging of that works to say that like Social Security is just to make sure that you're not extremely poor in old age? It shouldn't be your sort of like individual nest egg.
So the government is not very good at saving money. We have a $37 trillion deficit for a reason. And the government is also not very good at picking winners in the economy. Whenever governments have tried that, it's caused massive distortions. You just look at China now, they run into a lot of problems with their economic micromanagement. And I don't think that, our US politicians are much better at that either. And so if you have if Social Security was some fund that the government invested on behalf of the American people, like a sovereign wealth fund, some people have gotten excited about that idea. It would come with political interference. It would come with the government trying to pick winners. Sometimes they would pick losers. Some of those losers would become winners because the government elevated them, but it would make us all poorer. There's always a cost. There's always a trade-off to that. And so I'm not a fan of the government investing Social Security in private markets for that reason. Um, if the alternative then is you force people to save a certain amount and you let them make some limited investment choices, but that's basically what you have in Australia. You have some version of that in Chile. I think Singapore is another example. The issue with that is that you're still dictating when and how much people need to save. And in some cases, um, uh, in many cases, that doesn't make sense for everyone. Like if you look sort of at what makes the most sense for many people when they're younger, it's normal to go into debt, finance your education, maybe start a business. Um, and then as people get older, they tend to save more for their retirement because they're both better, more financially able to do so. And it's also like the proximity to that happening motivates them to actually take action. So you see that people who are in their 40s, 50s tend to have much higher account balances and be more actively involved in their retirement savings than people in their 20s. And that makes a lot of sense. But when you have the government mandate that every month you have to save 12%. You actually see people when they're younger go into debt at higher interest costs. So you're not actually making them better off. You're taking money away from them that now they're having to supplement, say, with other borrowing. That might be even credit card debt. Um, and then you are transferring like a certain amount of income to them in a form that you've determined. Like for some people, it might make sense to invest in a business. And then they don't might not even have to worry about retirement income because the business will provide it.
Mhm.
And so it's just that one size fits all compulsory savings that many people have thought of as the gold standard when it comes to um, reforming Social Security, I think it comes from the idea, well, we took defined benefit plans and made them into defined contribution plans, going from pensions, workers' pensions to 401ks, and that worked so well. Let's do the same thing with Social Security. It's a bit of like if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I think
Hmm.
we need to approach the public portion of the retirement system differently. And one of the things we talk about in the book is the World Bank uh, pillar framework. And I think it's kind of an interesting lens to look at what are the different aspects for how you can structure a system, because it's not just defined benefit or defined contribution, but like the World Bank pension pillar framework highlights that you might have a zero pillar, is what they call it, where you provide a general benefit that is available for everyone. That's sort of your anti-poverty benefit. And you might even finance that from your general taxation. Like there's no reason to have that tied to a payroll tax. You can do that, but you don't need to. And in the US, that's like supplemental security income. That's for really poor people that whose social security wouldn't even be sufficient to keep them out of poverty. And then the first pillar is like the mandatory government provision. That would be like Social Security in the US today, where you have a government transfer program that takes money from certain taxpayers and gives it to certain beneficiaries. And then this sort of like defined contribution version of that, like Australia has that in the World Bank pillar framework, is the second pillar. That's like a mandatory private savings scheme.
Hmm.
So people are in control of their investments for the most part with some limits, but they're forced to save a certain amount on a certain schedule that the government determines. And then the third pillar is like the 401k IRA system. That's your voluntary savings, where individuals actually take personal responsibility and set aside money when it suits them at the rate that makes the most sense for them at that time. And then the fourth pillar, they talk about other sources of retirement support, which are really neglected when we look at the US system, not in terms that they don't exist, but we don't tend to talk about them. And that are things like people who own their own homes, people who might have rental property that throws them income, people who own businesses, um, people who own other non-financial assets that throw a return, or going really old school, family support, which is how elderly people used to be taken care of, right? It was,
Hmm.
um, they would often live with their younger children and their families and would receive direct care in their old age.
Hmm. Well, one angle about this is that so each of those sort of forms of income and support you could have in old age, and the various ways of sort of saving money while you're employed, a lot of the question for which people are most interested in and which are most advantageous have to do with how they're taxed, right? And so, you know, a lot of the details of these international systems, if you dig down into like the very granular detail, they can be sort of very complex to compare, what's going on in the UK versus Australia versus Canada versus, Sweden or Germany. But when it comes to sort of the tax level, it seems like there's kind of three basic ways of looking at it. So if you're saving for retirement, we could tax your money when you earn it. We could tax it while it's invested and it's hopefully earning interest, or you could tax it when it leaves your retirement account and you go to spend it, right? And so a lot of these, you point out in the book that some of these um, categories of retirement savings are defined or they're described by when that taxes happen. So if you have a version that is if taxed when it's earned and taxed when it's accumulating interest, but not taxed when you spend it, then that would be taxed exempt. Or some versions are exempt taxed, or things like that. And then I just noticed that the health this is sort of slightly different from retirement savings, but in the U.S. we have health savings accounts, and those I think are the only accounts that I can think of that are exempt in all three of those categories. So they're advantageous if you have a high deductible health plan and you are eligible for an HSA. Maybe think about that. Um, so all of that is to say, because these kind of various tax levers that are different in different systems significantly impact the sort of arbitrage you're able to do in terms of what's more advantageous for each individual. how important is getting those tax levers right? Like, is a tax exempt system better than an exempt tax system? Or is it just the sort of kind of macroeconomics of the country in general will be determine which is better?
So the most important thing from an economic efficiency perspective is that you don't want your tax code to penalize saving, basically deferred consumption, and investment relative to immediate consumption. And when you tax money at the point at which it's earned. So you have your taxed portion at the beginning, and then you tax the gains, and then you tax it again. When you realize those gains, you end up penalizing saving, and then you will get less saving and less investment, and that means less growth. So that's sort of the underlying principle for why you want to avoid that double taxation of income when people choose to save and invest it, because it distorts those economic choices and then discourages that long-term saving and investing. In terms of frameworks for retirement, that's really the underlying reason for why you want to have a system that doesn't do that triple taxation. In terms of whether you do like the traditional 401k where you tax it, you don't tax it when people first save it, you don't tax the gains over time, and you only tax it on the way out when people are consuming both their principals and the gains over time. That's your exempt taxed. And then the Roth would be an example of taxed as soon as it's earned. And then you don't tax it again, neither the gains nor the consumption of those gains and the principal on the back end. But it really doesn't matter because economically, those two systems are neutral. Now, from a tax perspective, it matters because if you tax the income immediately, once it's earned, like Roth style, the government actually gets income tax right away, rather than having to wait for several decades before people end up withdrawing funds from their 401ks. So that reason has actually led to a lot of budget gimmicks where Congress has occasionally allowed certain Roth conversions in order to claim tax revenue immediately and then spend it immediately, of course, without accounting for the fact that it is reducing future tax revenue because those 401k funds are now converted to Roth. Yes, you got the tax money now, but you're going to miss it a couple decades down the road. So those are some of the fiscal considerations around how you structure those tax systems. But otherwise, it's really not that relevant. In terms of the HSA, I would say that is actually a problem because it distorts the savings and investment decisions because it's only triple exempt if you use it for healthcare.
Right.
And so it's a little more complicated. We've been big advocates, and we talk about this in the book too, for a simpler universal savings account that wouldn't be restricted for retirement or for healthcare, but that would allow people to save with this smart tax system, Roth style. Probably is the best way to go here. And they could use it for emergencies, for investing in a house, education, whatever it is they need, and not have the government micromanage the benefits of that tax deferred system or taxed upfront and then not taxed later for only particular purposes that the government has picked to deserve that kind of treatment. So if we can get away from complexity, that would be ideal. Now, the one benefit that the 401k system does have is that it's encouraged a lot of employers to auto enroll or make available 401ks to their employees and then to match even their contributions to some degree. And I think that explains the high uptake rate in the United States of 401ks among US workers and why US workers also tend to have some of the highest private savings generating income for them in retirement because the US tax system has created incentives for businesses to provide these accounts because the business also gets uh, uh, benefits on the tax side by paying some of the compensation to their employees in the form of a retirement contribution rather than as direct cash wages.
Right. And so there are potentially a lot of options that would improve the current Social Security system we have now, but also a lot of political barriers to making those significant changes. So I know you had Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana was a speaker at your conference, and then his comments are included in the book. And his specific proposal, which you sort of kind of alluded to the idea that he which you're not entirely supportive of, that that he would want a sort of investment fund, kind of market-based investment fund, and in his proposal got some pushback from some of the other participants that's noted, again noted in the book. But the book also reminds us that Social Security reform has become such a politically kind of touchy topic, while also being very important, that maybe we need to create a sort of safe space for for conversations like that to occur, so that people who are politicians who are out there who are running for re-election can feel like they can talk about it without worrying that their next opponent will immediately circle back and accuse them of trying to like abolish Social Security, which is why I thought it was fascinating the example of, I think it was New Zealand, where you said where all the parties like basically signed an agreement saying they wouldn't demagogue each other on on retirement security, which is kind of fascinating. So you know, what do you think is kind of the way forward there? Do you think we can encourage more members of Congress? Some are more outspoken than others. I think maybe Senator Cassidy's colleague, uh, uh, Senator Kennedy. He's known for being very outspoken on all sorts of things. Maybe we need the people with the most dramatic personalities to lead on this. But how do we give politicians who are honestly trying to do something good permission to say controversial things about Social Security reform?
Yeah, I think the New Zealand example is an interesting one, but as we're on the eve of a government shutdown, as we're speaking here on September 30th, it seems like it might be politically impossible to get the parties to agree not to attack each other on something as transformative as reforming Social Security. However, we do have a long history in the United States of using fiscal commissions to create exactly that kind of safe space and bipartisanship to be able to tackle difficult issues. The last Social Security reform that happened in 1983, more than 40 years ago, originated in such a commission. It was the Greenspan Commission at the time that came up with a portion of the reforms necessary to avoid automatic benefit cuts. This was also a time when the Social Security Trust Fund was about to be depleted. We're going to hit that window again in 2032, it looks like, under current projections. The Greenspan Commission actually did not resolve the entire shortfall. Congress had to step in, but the Greenspan Commission gave Congress enough cover in combination with the looming deadline of automatic benefit cuts to actually come to a compromise solution, which was better than what would have happened by default, right? And that's often the way you get compromise in the United States political context is you create a really horrendous, devastating default outcome that everyone wants to avoid. And then you bring the parties together in this way. More recently, we've had fiscal commissions that have failed, including the Simpson-Bowles Commission. They came up with some really good ideas, but they didn't get a presidential championship behind them. And then they also never got that congressional vote. So more recent versions of fiscal commission bills that have been introduced in Congress want to basically force Congress to have to take a vote on a final commission proposal to ensure that it actually has a chance in Congress. I've been advocating for a BRAC-like fiscal commission. I think that the politics of Social Security and Medicare are such that a regular fiscal commission will no longer cut it, that you will not get members of Congress to vote for the kinds of changes that would be necessary without giving them a lot more political cover. And so BRAC was the Base Realignment and Closure Commission, which we adopted after the Cold War, and it empowered independent experts to identify military bases for closure And Congress even excused itself from having to vote on the final closure list by making it a silent approval process where the default option was that whatever the commission recommended, so long as the president agreed, would go automatically into effect. And Congress had 45 days to vote to stop the commission proposal from going into effect. So changing that default of having to endorse those base closings versus just allowing them to happen was really critical for BRAC to be able to succeed. And so modeling a fiscal commission after that, maybe a budget realignment and control commission or a budget reduction and American competitiveness commission, depending on who the president in the White House is and what name appeals to them more. Um, might be the way forward for getting these key entitlement reforms done because some sacred cows will need to be slaughtered. Some oxes will need to be gored. There will likely be a combination of tax increases and spending reductions that will be an ultimate bipartisan outcome that can actually get enough support from both sides. And um, unfortunately, we have single issue groups on both sides, the ones that just want to increase entitlement benefits, the future of the country be damned. And then we have the same problem on the tax side with people who say any tax cut is a good tax cut. I don't care how big the deficit and the debt are, and I never want to increase taxes for any reason whatsoever. And with those two positions, you just can't find compromise. So you need to create that safe space. And I think a fiscal commission, specifically one modeled after BRAC, might just be what we need to get this done.
All right, fantastic. Maybe we'll nominate a an AI robot to make all the Social Security cuts and reforms for us, and then we can just blame him when it's not popular.
I should probably ask an AI what would be a socially just way of rebalancing the current Social Security system because it's really very lopsided in terms of the benefits that older retirees are have been promised to receive versus what younger generations can bear. I mean, the tax increase you're looking at going from roughly 12% of their payroll to 17% is what will be necessary if you only close the funding gap with tax increases on workers under the current structure. And we calculated that for a median wage worker, that's someone who earns about $70,000 a year. So they're not wealthy by any means. It would be a lifetime tax increase of over $100,000, and that's in net present value terms. And we're not even accounting for how much more they would have had if they had been able to invest that money. We're just assuming it's a straight transfer to Social Security, and that's a lot to swallow. You're talking about $3,000 a year for that person, which might be their grocery budget, for
Mhm.
example.
All right. Well, if you don't want a $3,000 a year tax increase, support Social Security reform. All right, Romina, thank you so much for being with us. This has been a fantastic conversation. And before we go, please tell everyone where they can find all of your great work online.
I highly recommend folks sign up for the Debt Dispatch on Substack. It's free, and that's the best way to keep on top of our work.
All right. Thanks again for being with us.
Thank you.